The military death penalty isn't just rare, it's the most severe sentence the U.S. Armed Forces can deliver. Since 1916, over 130 service members have been executed under military law. These weren't ordinary court-martial cases. These were crimes so shocking, they left scars on entire units, and sometimes the whole nation. In this video, we're diving into the haunting stories of the men who now sit on military death row. And we're starting with one of the most chilling cases in modern military history, one that unfolded not in enemy territory, but in the dead of night, among brothers in arms. Hassan Akbar. It was March 23, 2003. The invasion of Iraq had just begun, and American forces were on high alert. At Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait, soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division were bracing for war. Tension was thick, the kind that made sleep uneasy and nerves raw. But what no one expected was that the first attack wouldn't come from Iraqi forces. It would come from within. That night, the enemy wore the same uniform. His name was Sergeant Hassan Akbar, part of the 326th Engineer Battalion. He wasn't a stranger to problems. His superiors had noted his mood swings, his defiance, and his increasing isolation. To many who served with him, Akbar didn't seem like he belonged. But Akbar wasn't born into a military family or molded by a legacy of service. He was born Mark Fidel Cools in Los Angeles in 1971. After his father converted to Islam in prison, the family took on new names and new beliefs. Akbar was raised Muslim, deeply religious, and fiercely intelligent. By his 20s, he had earned degrees in both mechanical and aeronautical engineering from UC Davis, credentials that could have led him almost anywhere. But life didn't follow the promising path it hinted at. Financial burdens and personal instability steered him toward the Army. If he hoped for discipline and belonging, what he found instead was resentment, failure, and a growing sense of alienation. He was demoted, reprimanded, and often clashed with those in command. It was a slow descent into something darker. Unbeknownst to his unit, Akbar had been documenting his spiral in a private journal. One entry from early February 2003 read like a warning no one saw in time. I may not have killed any Muslims, but being in the Army is the same thing. I may have to make a choice very soon on who to kill. Another entry was even more direct. I'm going to try and kill as many of them as possible. No one around him had any idea what was about to unfold. In the early morning hours of March 23, just before 2 a.m., the base's generator suddenly failed, plunging Camp Pennsylvania into pitch-black silence. Most of the soldiers were asleep. It was the kind of darkness that conceals more than just the night. Then came the grenades. Akbar had stolen 4 M67 fragmentation grenades and an M4 rifle. He crept into the camp, targeting the tents where officers lay sleeping. One by one, he pulled the pins and lobbed them into the darkness. Boom, another tent. Boom. The silence was shattered by chaos. Soldiers stumbled out of their tents, choking on smoke, disoriented and terrified. Then the gunfire began. Akbar fired into the confusion, bullets cracking through canvas and into flesh. By the time it was over, 2 officers had been killed. Captain Christopher Seifert, 27, was shot in the back. Major Gregory Stone, 40, took more than 80 pieces of shrapnel to his body and didn't survive. 14 others were wounded, some critically. The camp, designed to shield soldiers from foreign enemies, had become the scene of an internal ambush. Akbar was tackled and taken into custody that same night. 2 years later, in April 2005, he stood trial at Fort Bragg. The courtroom was filled with military personnel, many of whom had known the victims, or had nearly been among them. The prosecution wasted no time. They brought forward the stolen grenades, the generator sabotage, and most damning of all, Akbar's own words, his journal entries. This was not a moment of madness, they argued. This was planned. The defense pushed back. They described a man who had battled mental illness for years, paranoia, sleep disorders, delusions. They said he had been unstable long before he joined the military and lacked the capacity to fully understand the consequences of his actions. But Akbar himself shattered any hopes of leniency. During the trial, he managed to smuggle a sharp object from a conference room. He used it to stab a military police officer. Further evidence, the prosecution said, that he was dangerous and deliberate. After just 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. guilty on 2 counts of premeditated murder and 3 counts of attempted premeditated murder. Exactly 1 week later, on his 34th birthday, Hassan Akbar was sentenced to death. He became the first American soldier since the Vietnam era to be sentenced to death for killing fellow service members during wartime. Today, he remains on military death row, housed at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. But here's the thing. Unlike civilian death row cases, a military execution can't happen unless the President of the United States signs off on it. And that hasn't happened since 1961. So for now, Akbar waits. Not free, not forgotten. And for the families of Captain Seyfert and Major Stone, the wounds of that night still haven't fully healed. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the brutality, it's the betrayal. In war, soldiers train to face danger from the outside. But at Camp Pennsylvania, the deadliest threat came from within. Timothy B. Hennis. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened until one spring morning in 1985 shattered that illusion forever. Just outside Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, a brutal crime scene was about to unravel into one of the most complex and controversial legal sagas in U.S. military history. At the center of it all, Army Sergeant Timothy B. Hennis. Let's rewind to early May of that year. Air Force Captain Gary Eastburn was stationed temporarily in Alabama for training. His wife, Katie, was at home managing life with their 3 young daughters, 5-year-old Kara, 3-year-old Aaron, and baby Jana, just shy of 2. The family was preparing for an overseas move to England, and in the middle of the transition, Katie placed a simple ad in the local paper. She was looking to rehome the family dog, an English setter named Dixie. On May 7th, a 27-year-old Army sergeant named Tim Hennis showed up at the Eastburn residence to adopt the dog. The exchange was brief, polite, unremarkable. He left with Dixie, and that should have been the end of the story. But just a few days later, the Eastburn household went completely silent. Captain Eastburn couldn't get through on the phone. No one answered the door. Neighbors started to worry. On May 12th, a concerned friend contacted the police, and an officer accompanied her to the house. What they found inside was the stuff of nightmares. Katie Eastburn had been raped and stabbed repeatedly. Her 2 older daughters, Kara and Aaron, were also murdered. One stabbed, the other bludgeoned. The youngest, Jana, was discovered alive in her crib, severely dehydrated, but miraculously untouched. It didn't take long for investigators to trace the timeline back to the man who had come to adopt the dog. A neighbor reported seeing a tall white man wearing a black members-only jacket, leaving the Eastburns' driveway early on May 10th, carrying what looked like a garbage bag. The witness later identified Hennis in a photo lineup. That, paired with Katie's recent contact with him, made him the prime suspect. Digging deeper, investigators learned that someone had used Katie's ATM card after her death to withdraw $300. Coincidentally, around the same time, Hennis was struggling financially. The circumstantial evidence was stacking up. In 1986, Timothy Hennis was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of rape. The trial was swift. The jury deliberated for 10 hours before delivering a guilty verdict. Hennis was sentenced to death and sent to Central Prison in Raleigh. But the story didn't end there. In a dramatic twist, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the conviction 2 years later. The reason? They ruled that graphic crime scene photos may have unfairly swayed the jury's emotions. Hennis was granted a retrial. The second time around, his defense team came in swinging. They picked apart the prosecution's timeline, challenged eyewitness reliability, and created just enough doubt to tip the scales. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 2 days, then returned with a verdict that stunned the courtroom: not guilty. Timothy Hennis walked out a free man in 1989. Not only that, he rejoined the U.S. Army, continuing to serve without issue for the next 15 years. By the time he retired in 2004, many assumed the Eastburn case was closed for good. But justice, as it turned out, wasn't done with him yet. In 2006, cold case investigators revisited the evidence using advanced DNA testing techniques that hadn't been available in the 80s. One sample in particular, semen collected from Katie Eastburn's body, was sent for analysis. The results were undeniable. The DNA was a direct match to Timothy Hennis. Not just a likelihood, statistical analysis showed it was 1.2 quadrillion times more likely to belong to him than to anyone else. But there was a catch. Hennis had already been acquitted. Under the Constitution's double jeopardy clause, he couldn't be tried again in a civilian court for the same crime. That's when military prosecutors stepped in with a rarely used maneuver. Because Hennis had served in the Army and because murder is a crime under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, they recalled him to active duty just to try him under military law. It was a bold and controversial move, but it worked. In 2010, 25 years after the original murders, Hennis stood trial for the third time, this time in a military courtroom at Fort Bragg. The prosecution brought in the DNA evidence, forensic experts, and a case now buttressed by science rather than speculation. The jury didn't take long. They found him guilty, again of 3 counts of premeditated murder. On April 15, 2010, Timothy Hennis was sentenced to death for the second time in his life. He was stripped of rank, dishonorably discharged, and transferred to death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. To this day, he remains there, awaiting execution. The case of Timothy Hennis is more than a chilling story of violence. It's a legal roller coaster that spans decades, tests the boundaries of justice, and forces us to ask hard questions. Can a man be tried 3 times for the same crime? How far can the government go in the pursuit of accountability? And perhaps most haunting of all, what if the second trial had gone just slightly differently? One thing is certain, the memory of what happened in that quiet North Carolina home has never faded. And the debate around Hennis's guilt, his trials, and his fate continues to stir controversy even now, years later. Nidal Malik Hassan, November 5, 2009, a date etched in the darkest chapters of U.S. military history. Fort Hood, Texas, a sprawling Army base bustling with soldiers preparing for deployment, became the scene of a nightmare few could have foreseen. But this was no enemy attack from afar. The shooter was not a foreign adversary. He was one of their own. Major Nidal Malik Hassan, an Army psychiatrist entrusted with caring for the minds of soldiers, not destroying them, stepped into the Soldier Readiness Processing Center that morning, armed and ready to unleash terror. Carrying an FN-57 pistol and more than 200 rounds of ammunition, Hassan opened fire without warning. Witnesses later recounted hearing him shout, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," before the chaos erupted. On the surface, Hassan's life told the story of a promising American success. Born in 1970 to Palestinian parents and raised in Virginia, he climbed the ranks through sheer academic achievement. A Virginia Tech graduate, an Army scholarship for medical school, psychiatric training at Walter Reed, all the credentials of a dedicated military professional. But beneath this veneer, something darker was taking root. Hassan struggled deeply with the realities of war. He was known to voice increasingly radical and anti-American sentiments, even defending acts of terrorism in presentations to colleagues. His supervisors were uneasy but unsure how to handle the warning signs. Then came the news that seemed to push him over the edge. The Army was sending him to Afghanistan. Around the same time, Hassan began exchanging emails with Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical cleric infamous for inspiring terrorist attacks. Although the FBI monitored these communications, they concluded Hassan was merely conducting research on Muslim soldiers in the military. In hindsight, that conclusion was tragically flawed. Just 2 days before the shooting, Hassan started giving away his belongings to neighbors, a quiet but chilling farewell. What followed was a massacre. When the smoke cleared, 13 people lay dead, 32 more injured. Officer Kimberly Munley, one of the first to respond, engaged Hassan in a fierce shootout and was wounded herself. Ultimately, another officer shot Hassan multiple times, ending the attack, but leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The incident sparked intense debate. Initially labeled workplace violence, the attack was later described by a Senate report as the deadliest terrorist act on U.S. soil since 9/11. Hassan's trial was equally unusual. He chose to represent himself, admitting to the shootings and declaring he had switched sides, seeing himself as a warrior against American forces rather than a defender. He offered little defense, showing no remorse. After deliberation, a military jury convicted him on all counts, 13 murders, 32 attempted murders. In August 2013, he was sentenced to death. Colonel Mike Mulligan, the lead prosecutor, delivered a powerful rebuke. His death is not his gift to God, it's his debt to society. He will never be a martyr. Today, Hassan, now simply inmate Hassan, remains on death row at Fort Leavenworth, stripped of rank and confined to a wheelchair. Yet even behind bars, his extremist views persist. At one point, he sent a letter to the leader of ISIS, asking to become a citizen of the Islamic State. The Fort Hood shooting is a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come from within, and the battle for loyalty and identity can have devastating consequences. Ronald Gray, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a community known for its tight-knit military spirit and quiet suburban calm. But between 1986 and 1987, that peace shattered. A terrifying string of violent crimes sent shockwaves through the base and surrounding neighborhoods, leaving everyone searching for answers. Unlike some cases where warning signs flashed bright, this time the predator concealed himself perfectly in plain sight. His name, Ronald Gray. Born August 14, 1965, little is documented about Gray's early years. When he arrived at Fort Bragg, he was just another soldier among many, assigned to traffic control with the elite 82nd Airborne Division. Yet behind his uniform hid something far darker. It began on April 27, 1986, when 23-year-old college student Linda Jean Coates was found brutally murdered. At first, authorities chalked it up to a tragic but isolated incident. That assumption would soon prove dangerously wrong. Fast forward to the same year, Gray struck again. He abducted, sexually assaulted, and killed 18-year-old Tammy Cofer Wilson. Then, just 4 days later, he targeted another young woman, Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, also 18. Two witnesses saw Laura with a man matching Gray's description at a local Kmart. The next morning, her car was discovered just a block from her home, bearing 3 of Gray's fingerprints on the hood. Weeks later, Laura's body was recovered. She had been sexually assaulted and sodomized, left partially clothed and badly decomposed. Multiple gunshot wounds, neck, forehead, chest, and back revealed the violence she endured. Nearby, investigators found the murder weapon, a .22 caliber pistol Gray had stolen months earlier. But Gray's reign of terror wasn't over. On January 3, 1987, he visited the barracks room of 19-year-old Private Marianne Lang Namath. Claiming to invite her to a party, he gained entry. Once inside, he pulled a knife, bound her hands, and assaulted her. Then he stabbed her in the neck and side, warning he'd return to kill her if she spoke. Against all odds, Marianne survived, despite a collapsed lung and severe injuries. Her courage and testimony would later be crucial in bringing Gray to justice. Yet Gray struck once more. Just 3 days after Marianne's attack, Gray used the alias Ron to call a cab. The driver was 23-year-old Kimberly Ann Ruggles. She arrived at Gray's address early the next morning and never returned home. Military police found Kimberly's abandoned taxi near the woods. Nearby lay her body, stabbed 7 times. This time, the evidence was unmistakable. Gray's fingerprints were inside the taxi. Kimberly's fingerprints were found on money in his possession. When his photo aired on local news, Marianne instantly recognized him as her attacker. In 1988, Gray faced trials in both civilian and military courts. The civilian jury convicted him, sentencing him to 8 life terms. The military court went further, finding him guilty of 4 murders, 1 attempted murder, and 8 sexual assaults, and sentenced him to death. Yet for nearly 2 decades, Gray's execution remained stalled. In 2008, after a Department of Justice review, President George W. Bush approved Gray's execution, making him the first U.S. service member since 1961 to be cleared for the death penalty. Army Secretary Pete Guerin set the date, December 10, 2008. But weeks before the scheduled execution, a federal judge issued a stay, allowing Gray more time to pursue appeals. Those appeals stretched on for years. In 2012, the Army Court of Criminal Appeals denied his petition. In 2017, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces rejected it again. Finally, in March 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his last appeal. Today, Ronald Gray remains confined at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Having spent over 35 years on military death row, Gray holds the grim distinction as the longest-serving inmate under the modern U.S. military justice system. His story, and the stories of others like him, stand as stark reminders of how far one can betray the very uniform they swore to honor. If this video resonated with you, please like and subscribe. It means more than you know. Thanks for watching.